at these same public opinion polls, what you actually find out is the people that are paying the most attention to healthcare reform were the most confused. The more you paid attention, the more confused you got. It got to the point when I was paying attention to this in late 2009 where I stopped following it altogether. I said, screw it. I'm not going to watch this coverage anymore and read about it because there's no transparency in any of it. All I'm hearing about is death panels and rationing, and I'll just wait for the final legislative product and figure out what the heck's going on. My suspicion was confirmed when I actually saw the data very closely. You can take a look at the Pew Research Center data, or you can wait for the book coming out next spring. By July of 2009, a bare majority of those who followed the news and the news on healthcare very closely said that it was very hard to understand. The majority of Americans who followed it closely said it was hard to understand. That was a little over 50% in July 2009. You could say, well, maybe if they followed it for 3 months, because when the question was asked again, maybe they were less confused. It would be nice to think, wouldn't it? You pay more attention to things and you become more informed. They were more misinformed. By September of 2009, it had gotten to over 60% of people who very closely followed healthcare reform. They found it very difficult to understand. The more you paid attention, the less you knew about it. The more confused that you were. People weren't stupid. They weren't morons. They were asked, what do you think about the media coverage? Almost all of them said it was awful. That was the most prominent answer. They said, poor media coverage. It's really, really bad. And we can't just blame the media because we can also blame an ineffectual Democratic Party which didn't have a coherent policy. You had all different types of proposals floating around. Some people were voting with the Democrats who wanted universal health care, like Bernie Sanders, although he's an independent. Some people wanted a public option. People like Max Baucus wanted almost nothing, just pre-existing conditions and maybe some state exchanges. So it's not surprising that people didn't know what was going on. You had all these options out there. Nobody knows what's going to come out of this process because the whole party is not unified. And then you got people on the other side screaming about death panels and rationing and Marxism. Is it any surprise that people pay more and more attention to this? They become more and more ignorant and confused. 80% of people, by the way, said that they were getting their information on healthcare reform from the media. So it's not like people were getting it primarily from talking to other people. Even if they were doing that, where's that information coming from? This is well known amongst media scholars. They understand that at the base of everything is mass media and that being directed by a political system that's supplying it information. How else are you going to get information? The vast majority of people don't have direct experience with every policy issue, so they get that information from the mass media. What can we do about these problems of media-induced and political-induced ignorance? Well, the first most obvious lesson is we need to get out there and talk to all of our friends who don't come to OUL events. We need to get them to understand. The more you pay attention to New York Times, and you can thumb your nose all you want at Fox News and Rush Limbaugh, it doesn't mean that you're more informed necessarily. This is a problem across all these different media outlets nationally that we're talking about. You need to go outside of corporate media and you need to get alternative opinions. This is not relevant for a lot of people here because a lot of you already follow alternative media. You found out about OUL and it's not being advertised in the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times, so that's good. But we need to talk to people around us about getting outside of mass media sources and outside of corporate media. Do we blame the public for this ignorance? On one level, I think you have to say yes, because ultimately it's your responsibility as a citizen to cut through the crap. You have to know that there's a political system out there that's dominated by spin, and that media system is going to be a product of that spin. So you have to do the work. No one's going to give you the information, and it's not just going to fall into your lap. On the other hand, we need to understand the real limits that people are facing. If you're an average person and you don't have access to an event like this, and you're not reading these kinds of critical studies that we're talking about here, you're going to go follow these news outlets, and you're going to become more confused, and you're going to think you're doing a good job. You're going to think, what? I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, right? I'm following the news. I'm looking at Fox News on one side. I'm looking at MSNBC on the other. They don't know about these other sources that are way outside of that narrow spectrum. So we have to help them in terms of getting beyond this very narrow field of opinion. So in short, we need to mobilize people. We need to become active. And the first step is obviously informing people, and we obviously need to do something too, outside of just informing, but we need to build some sort of movement outside of mass media, which is based upon alternative sources of information, people getting information out there that you're not going to hear about. I'm not saying tomorrow you can come back from this discussion and say, Anthony DiMaggio said I don't have to follow media anymore because people become more stupid. So I don't have to pay attention at all. I can just watch The Simpsons. No, you do need to pay attention to what's going on in the news, and you need to do more than that. You need to follow these other sources outside of mass media. So we need more engaged citizens, not less. And that's one area where I do blame the public very much. We have this culture of apathy, which is kind of insane if you think about it at this point with how bad the economy is and the kinds of draconian budget cuts that are being handed down. We have almost 20,000 teachers are getting pink slips in this state. Maybe a lot of them won't get fired, hopefully, but we have this $26 billion stimulus that just came down from the government, and a lot of states are saying they're just going to hold that money now. They're going to hold it for the future, maybe. They'll fill in some budget holes later. So none of this is for certain that these aren't going to be massive budget cuts that we're going to be seeing down the road and a much worsening economy. So we need to get organized and we need to get educated right now, and we need to know what's going on before it's too late. So I hope that we've taken some sort of step towards that here. And I'm going to stop now, and maybe we can have some discussion about these issues.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I had a quick question, if I might. So in your book, When Media Goes to War, you talk, I think, very effectively about how anti-war sentiment during the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War was effectively omitted from the mass media. And then you go on to talk about journalistic norms. So my question is about causality. How does commercial mass media, mainstream media, how is it able to ignore what, in my opinion, was a much larger anti-war feeling among the American populace than, for example, the radicalism of the Tea Party, which in my mind appears to be a smaller number of people. That is to say, had there been a larger progressive or leftist movement, would it have moved the agenda, as you say, of the mass media? And historically speaking, how does that compare to other protests eras? For example, the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s, which did have, as I recall, significant media exposure.
I think that's a really good point that you're making, and good questions. First, if I'm going to talk about this idea of the mass left movements versus Tea Party movements, my understanding, because I've studied social movements for about 8 years now, I've been a participant in them since the pre-Iraq War protests. There's not really much social movement on the left anymore, so now I got to go to these pseudo-social movements on the right and study those. But it's interesting because you learn actually how they're covered differently than mass movements on the left. My impression is the reason the Tea Party gets so much attention, it doesn't have anything to do with numbers, because on the face of it, it looks like there's a lot of people. I counted all the local protests and the alleged turnouts, and it was maybe somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people for this April across the country for these tax day rallies. But if you actually take a close look across the different alleged chapters of the Tea Party, first of all, there aren't any chapters. Go take a look in Illinois and go look at Chicago, and you won't find barely any chapters. I was able to find maybe 4 or 5 chapters worth observing, and you look at 92% of these cities that claim to have a turnout for this tax day rally don't have any evidence whatsoever of meetings. They don't have meetings. The Tea Party people think you don't have to have meetings to have a social movement. You can have some guy who blasts out emails, and he works with the Republican Party in each local chapter, and he gets a bunch of people to show up because they're on a listserv. And that's exactly the terms that they use when you go sit in on these very few meetings that actually take place on the right, these Tea Party organizational meetings. They openly complain that they don't think they should have to organize. The meeting leaders will say, this is hard work. We don't like doing this. We can't run these meetings anymore, not even one a month. Why do they get so much attention? Because it's a Republican operation. All of the local Republicans who are running for office for the House of Representatives or for the Senate or even state and national, they're all running under this Tea Party brand, and they're all the ones coordinating these email blasts and working with 1 or 2 people in each city that actually does have some sort of organization. Now, I'm not saying it's not activism, but it's not a social movement. It's not even close.